Okay, so remember, you decided to be part of a society, or you were born into a society. And the way that that society is set up is that we expect that people are going to answer the call to join together in these permanent unions in order to essentially make babies. But they agree to take care of the babies emotionally and economically, and essentially to take care of one another in the same way. So then the question is, well, who's included in this family? Who are you promising to take care of economically and take care of emotionally? And so one of the first distinctions that we might have to make is who is related to us versus who is our family. Kinship is your traceable ancestry. So if you've ever taken one of these ancestry.com kind of things that you can trace by your DNA, or if you are better than I am in keeping up with these tables, like who's your first cousin, who's your second cousin, who's your third cousin twice removed, and I can't ever keep up with what that table is. I can tell you who my mom is, who my sister is, and I can tell you what grandparents and great great grandparents, because I get some understanding of that. But that's essentially saying who is related to you by blood. Remember, family is by marriage, by blood, or by adoption. So can you trace your ancestry by blood, or sort of your from your family of origin, and then after you get married, your family of procreation? How does that work? So when we're talking kin, we're talking people who you are related to, and that matters in a legal construct. For instance, again, who is economically responsible for you? If you leave a kid home and go on vacation, then the question is, not only a question of safety, but if you're responsible for the emotional and psychological and economic needs of that kid, then that'll get you in a lot of trouble, right? Because that is your responsibility. If you have a kid and the parents have gone away or passed away, one of the first questions is there a relative that can take on the responsibility for this kid? There's a lot of emotional reasons why we might have to do that, but legally, we've got to make some determination of that. If your great great grandparent passed away, and maybe somebody that you've never known, and they've got some assets, some property, then the government has to say, well, who does this stuff belong to now? So questions of inheritance of property, responsibility for businesses, sometimes responsibility for debts. Those are questions. You may have taken one of these ancestry, tests, for instance. People do it all the time, and then may find, oh, I'm related to such and such on the other side of the world. That person is your kin if you can trace your ancestry similarly. But if that person break up with their boyfriend and they're having an emotional crisis, there's no expectation that they're going to call you, or that even if they found you on Facebook and did, that you would have that kind of emotional response to them. Similarly, if they're having problems with paying their mortgage that month, then there's no expectation that you would do it, because you've got no emotional responsibility for them or any economic responsibility for them, even though we're kin. So the distinction between who's your kin and who's your family definitely can be based on those sort of blood relations, but a lot of that sort of falls into culturally and socially how we make that determination. So one of those rules that we might pay attention to when we think about families in a society are rules of lineage or rules of descent, right? Again, if you're tracing your ancestry from your family of origin, or once you get married and have children, your family of procreation, we want to know, how are we understanding the development or the creation of that family based on these rules of lineage. Some societies follow a unilateral descent pattern. And when we talk unilaterally, we're talking either patrilineal, sorry for misspelling that word, or matrilineal. And you can probably guess what that is. So lineal, we're talking about the line, like how do you trace your line? Patrilineal societies follow that kinship line or that relation line based on the father's line. So you would be considered in the ancestry line of your father's side of the family. If it's a matrilineal pattern, then you follow your kinship based on your mother's side of the family. We are a bilateral society for the most part in the United States, which means we tend to recognize kinship or ancestry or family lines both on our mother's side and on our father's side. One of the ways you can sort of get a hint of how people do this is maybe looking at their naming conventions. Do you take your father's last name, or do you take your mother's last name? Or even if your father and mother are married, do you take your mother's family's last name, or do you take both last names of both family sides? So for some societies, you can get a sense of how they do this by looking at their naming conventions, or at least how they may have done that historically. So we care about how you're following this, again, because if you are matrilineal and you follow the lineage of your mother's side, then when your parents got married, you are technically related to your parents and your mother's side of the family, even though your father is related to his side of the family, because that's his family of origin. You're not related to his family of origin. You're related to your mother's family of origin and the family of procreation that they create. So like your line after that, following your mother's side. So that kind of distinction is important. That being the case, not just how we might name these families, but now the question becomes, where do these families live, right? And so we might also talk about residential patterns, sorry. And it seems simple enough, two people get married, they get a house, or, they move into the neighborhood. But these residential patterns often are reflective of lineage patterns, on the one hand, in terms of kinship, but tells us a lot about societies. And again, how we understand their families to be functioning, who's responsible for the emotional and economic needs of each one of those families. So we might say that some patterns are patrilocal, and some patterns are matrilocal or matrilocal. I don't know how you pronounce that. And that sounds right. Local, locale, place, patra, father. You can get the sense of it. So this idea is, if you get married in a patrilocal society, if I'm a daughter and I get married to a man, then I'm going to move in either directly in the parent's house, his family's house, or we're going to live in his family's neighborhood, or we're going to live in his family's compound. And essentially me marrying into that family says that I and our family of procreation is essentially going to be the responsibility of, emotionally and or economically, the responsibility of the man's side of the family. And then the flip of that is, matrilocally, what does that mean? That means he gets married, he's expected to move in my family's house, or my family's neighborhood, or my family's city, or just generally in that area. And again, that residential pattern might follow those lineage patterns, not necessarily, but it's reflective of, who do you think is responsible for this family? Who is going to be the family that you go to for help? Who is going to be the family that you see most of the time, right? What those residential patterns are, again, isn't even necessarily going to be a legal construct, although in some expectations, some societies, you might say, no, you got married, this is where you expect it to go. So much so that you get married and you're expected to go move in with that side of the family. Now your side of the family might economically just not have any requirement to be responsible for you. And when resources are tight, that might be a legal thing that needs to be situated very clearly. So those residential patterns as to what happens with that family of procreation is of interest to understand how that society is working. One of the things that your textbook doesn't mention is this idea of neolocal residential patterns. And we see that more in modern times, all the way back until we were talking about sort of the very beginning of the development of sociology as a discipline, this industrial revolution where people left their homestead or their farm life or their small villages, and everybody worked in the cities and lived in the cities. That means when new families of procreation formed, they live in a house that is separate from, or they live in a place, a new family moves to a location that is new, neo-local, new in comparison to where the husband side of the family is or the wife's side of the family is. And again, it seems totally normal because that's what happens more times than not now. We're going to get to education. We've talked about it over time. People go away, they go to college, they meet the person who they're going to marry. They get married and they decide to stay in Tennessee because that's where their college is. It doesn't matter that his family is from Seattle and her family is from Florida. They don't have to go back to either one of those places. They just set up shop in Tennessee, or one of them takes a job in Michigan, and that's where they live. That they live separately from that family is quite significant because when we talk about how we socialize one another or what we expect to be passing along through society, how do we understand to be a married couple? What kinds of ways do we understand to be a parent, and what family should look like, and how to provide one another for one another emotionally or economically, or generally, how do we sort of foster the bonds of kinship and create what families should be getting from one another. Where you live, it seems simple enough, but it's really important. And so even some of these challenges, remember, anytime you've got these debates over family values and what's expected and how are we doing as a society, or these young people are out here, they live, far, far away from their families, that is breaking down our neighborhoods and our families are weakening, and that's going to be terrible for society. On the one hand, that feels like somebody is being just, overly dramatic about this thing, but that's a very valid thought process, right? Because if you're not doing the things to carry on the traditions of your family or your family community in a way that is reflected just in the simple choice of where you live, then that could mean big change for the way the society operates. Again, we left the homesteads and moved into the cities again, very blanket statement as to how that thing worked, but it literally changed the way the society operates based on the ways that where we live and even who we consider to be our family, for instance, versus who we're just akin to. And what kinds of ways do we expect to take care of one another? When we're talking about residence patterns, the last distinction that I want to make for you is this distinction between the nuclear family and the extended family. And this is important because we make this distinction colloquially or in our everyday language. That's not exactly the definition in sociology, for instance. When you're talking about a nuclear family, you're only talking about the married parents and the children themselves, the two parents and the children, right? They are the core or the nucleus of the family unit, the family being this social institution, the nucleus. When we're talking the extended family, the book gives you the definition that it's a household that includes at least one parent and child, as well as other relatives like grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. And in this case, it confines that extended family into who lives in the household. So we're not talking about the people who you only see during weddings and funerals, or family reunions, or when this family in Tennessee gets together with the family in Florida or the family in Seattle. That's not is that your family? Yes. Is that your kin? Absolutely. But the distinction that I want to know is, if I'm talking about the ways that this day-to-day family operates, who is in their household, then I want to know, is there any extended family in the household? I want to know who else is in the household other than the parents and the children. So it's not exactly what we think about colloquially, or there winds up being no end to what we think about colloquially as to who people include in their extended family or not. So in this case, when I talk about the extended family, I just want to know, in that household, are there members of the household family, for instance, different than just the core, the parents and their children? Okay, end of this video.